I'm making this quick video for Maddie because, as you know, her lid arrived without the palette attached and she should be getting it soon. I wanted to just quickly show her what to do in the interim because she has her wheel measured out, her shapes measured out, and her scales measured out, but she wants to be able to get as much done of this as possible before all the other elements are put in place in terms of the palette and stuff like that. That's my dog eating in the background, which she waited right until I hit play to do, so ignore that. So I'm just going to do a quick example for Maddie of what to do when you only have one tube. I don't want you to get everything out and try to do it in the lid. This is just the lid. It's an extra mixing area, but I'm going to publish this for everybody because it's still the same technique, and I think it might be helpful as you're struggling in terms of saturation. Because your shapes can be all the same color. Two of your scales can be all one color. Two of the scales are color to color, so those have two. And the wheel, of course, is the result of your palette. But if you only have this side to do, you can skip two of the scales and do everything else with one color. So I just grabbed a color and I picked red, and it fell. Hold on, let me grab it. Okay, sorry about that. Alright, so I just picked a color that comes in the tube, so there's no mixing involved. And you can start this way. It's best to do the right side first. Look at this tiny, barely comes out. I'm just going to put some there. Just a little. Now that little bit is probably enough for the whole project on the right side, but we'll see. You do want to play with different saturation. So don't make all your shapes the same saturation. That's too much, but anyway. I just don't want you to waste paint on the lid, is what I mean, before you have your palette. Plus, you'll tend to do it too dark. So you want to have your different widths of brushes, some wider, some narrower, so that you can do the bigger shapes with the correct brush, medium for the others. If you use a brush that's too small, the project doesn't work, because then you're going like this, and then you have streaks. If you have one big brush, boom. So you want to use the biggest flat brush you can find for these areas. You also want to take a big brush, throw your water in. You'll do this in the middle of your palette every time. You can even pour it in, just so you have a puddle that's just water. Everything in watercolor happens in a puddle, not with this stuff. That stuff is sort of secondary. When you have a really, really big puddle, dip just a corner of your brush into this tiny little bit of red. Pull it in there. Tiny bit more. It should be pale, pale pink. You got to move it around so there's no streaks and no clunks of paint on your brush. Before you fill it in, test it out. That's actually a really nice saturation, but it's too wet. That means my brush is pretty good. It's holding a lot of water. I'm going to make it slightly darker just so you can see it. Remember to make sure it's delicate, but you still have to mush it around. Now watch when I test it. That's a good saturation. Can you see that? I'm not sure. The light is weird today because it's all gloomy out there. I'm going to just do this one. Now that I know this brush holds a lot of water, squeeze it a little. Then you won't have this problem of too much puddly. So I tested it on this other paper. That's better. So now I can put it in here. And you want it to be quick. All I'm doing is getting around until the whole thing's covered, and then allow the brush to take the dot of water off at the end. So that's perfect. Perfect saturation. On the scales, you're going to go color to blank. So in that case, you have to wet this, not wet, but dampen. I think the biggest problem with scales people have is they make it too wet. It's just to give you more time. It's just to, you can subtly see that it looks a little slightly darker than the paper. Keep squeezing out too, especially once you realize a brush holds water. It's actually a good sign. And then here's a different brush that's probably different in how it holds water. Now in this one, I'm going to use a little more paint because it's wet, and I'm going to pull, see, it's too wet, but I'm going to pull this red into blank. And we're just kind of feathering it in to the white. Good, and that's blank. And then if you want, you can do a tiny bit more saturation just to get a little more drama on this side. But you don't want to do it if you think it's going to mess it up. But I just feel like I need to have a little more value and saturation over here. Gee, I'm having a good day. This little mini video is better than my regular. That's the thing, is you never know with watercolor. You just never know. You might just grab the right brush or have the right lighting or be in the right mood or whatever it is. Other days it's a disaster and you just have to just let it go and go for a walk, come back and try another way. So I'm going to just do the one on the top. But this, you do 2 practice runs, red to blank, red to blank. Test first, always. It's tempting not to test. It's tempting. I'm trying to do a little different kind of a saturation on this one just to challenge myself with the technique. But you can see I'm using a whole sheet just for this. I got a whole sheet I'm already covering and I'm just doing this. Now I want to use the biggest brush I have to get in here, because if I try to get too small, it's easier when it goes off the edge. You want to have some shapes off the edge. If I go too small of a brush, it dries so fast. That's in the way. I'm going to have to switch just because that jar is in the way. So you have to quickly rush. If you don't grab it fast, you have this weird edge that dries right inside your shape that's very undesirable. Or you end up with a different saturation within the same shape, where it's like light and dark and bright and dark. The paper tester on the side acts like a sponge as well. It's pulling out just enough paint. See, that would have created a background. See how that has, it's starting to pull together, wet and wet, in an undesirable way. Whoops, shoot. I was doing good too. All right, that's not too bad. And then finally you would do, I did a narrower one down here. Dampen it. Try to dampen it while the brush is clean. And then we're gonna take, I'll do a little bolder. But see how this paint, I'll never use this paint. I should have stopped the first time. This blob now is wasted. All you can do is transport it into your palette when it arrives. If you don't have your palette like Maddie's, you can just pull it in. It's a little harder when it's darker, and I put too much water in the brush. When it starts to separate like this and get all puddly, it means you just didn't do this first enough to get the excess out. So see how it's slightly different saturation. You can't see that I've gone side to side. You don't want streaks, ever. If your brush strokes show side to side or up and down, that's a problem. You have to be able to do all of this so softly and gently within this little stretch of dampened rectangle, and it could be a huge strand. Either way, you have to use the thicker brush and do 1 or 2 hits. You can't just keep going. People go like this and then their scale looks like this, or they go up and down. We don't want that. We want it smooth. That's what makes even washing wet and wet blending so delicate. But you can see how for Maddie, you can do all this with a dot of one color out of the tube. This way you can fill your entire right sheet except your 2 color to color. And on the left side you can do your wheel when you get your palette. I just wanted to post this because I think it's helpful for everyone, just the technique. You can do this so many different times.